All right, students, let's get going with our second set of boards here on the 20th century, Unit 6, 1900 to present time. Our essential question: how did the wars of the early 1900s shape the rest of the world? So we talked about World War I. Now we're talking about World War II. Prior to World War II, there was a buildup of fascism in Italy and Germany, which becomes a tipping point that sends Europe back to war. So, like 30 years before this, World War I had taken place, and now we've got World War II arising. Stalin rules the USSR as a dictator, tries to increase USSR's power. Hitler uses Blitzkrieg, or a lightning war, to invade Poland in 1939. Russia and Germany divide Poland, kind of in half, and the poor Polish don't have anything to claim as their own country. This was typically known as the beginning of World War II. In the spring of 1940, Hitler invades Holland and Belgium, and then France, and takes Paris. We talked about the Schlieffen Plan with World War I and how that did not work. Well, it worked very well for Hitler. Great Britain kind of stands alone against Germany, goes into the Battle of Britain, where the British were fighting off the Germans, who were continuously air bombing them every single day for quite a long period of time. It was Hitler's goal to bomb them into submission, and then they were going to invade the island and take over Great Britain. But during the Battle of Britain, the British held their ground against the Nazis. Now, Hitler ignores a pact with Russia and attacks into Russia. This might have been one of his big downfalls, but in the meantime, in the Pacific, the Japanese have taken China and many Southeast Asian countries. They're looking for natural resources. They're a small island. It doesn't have as many natural resources as they would like, and they're looking for natural resources, especially the Philippines. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into war. I think it was December 8th or sometime right around there. They also took over the Philippines, which had a lot of oil that the Japanese sorely sought. The United States and the British forces, they combine after we are entered into the war, land during D-Day in June of 1944 on the French land to fight against Germans who occupied France. The USSR steadily advanced against the eastern front of Germany. So remember, just like in World War I, where Germany has to fight two fronts, one to the east, one to the west, same thing in World War II. United States, British, and French push into Germany as USSR takes Berlin in 1945. Hitler commits suicide in the spring of 1945, and the war ends in Europe. Fighting in the Pacific continues into the summer months with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs that finally ended World War II. So some of the consequences of World War II, some of the things that came out of it: we had the Holocaust, where the German government ordered the final solution to try to kill all European Jews. As many as 6 million Jews were killed, as well as Gypsies, Poles, Slavs, homosexuals, disabled people, political prisoners. So this was a pretty tragic event that took place during this time period. The United Nations is created to help keep world peace. War crimes tribunals were held to try those that committed crimes against humanity, and this is a big turning point because it's the first time in history that there was such tribunals. The Marshall Plan was a plan created by the United States to rebuild Europe and just give them essentially money, tons of money. The decline of colonialism around the world. Eventually, the likes of like India and many countries in Africa would be, or many colonies in Africa would become countries. And it was the start of the Cold War, which is what's on our next board here. So let's slide this over. And when we're looking at this next board, the Cold War. After World War II, capitalist United States and communist USSR emerged. As superpowers, world was divided between these two powers. You had Eastern Europe got stuck behind the Iron Curtain of communism. Eastern Germany and Berlin were cut off. The United States airdropped food and supplies to those in need. and really tried to help, lend a helping hand to those stuck behind this Iron Curtain. The Soviet bloc countries versus the Western bloc countries emerged. NATO was formed, and in response to that, the Warsaw Pact was formed by Eastern Bloc countries. NATO still survives to this day, but the Warsaw Pact dissolved back in the 90s. Now, the nuclear arms race builds up and becomes out of control versus USSR. We started moving nukes into Turkey. As we'll talk in our next boards, the USSR tried to move nukes into Cuba. I mean, it became out of control. Now, at the same time, China becomes a communist country. Manchu dynasty ends in 1911, and Sun Yat-sen begins to build a nationalistic government. It was heavily backed by the United States, but it just wasn't as successful as it could have been. The Japanese and communists were against Sun Yat-sen. After World War II, China fought a civil war in which the communists, under the rule of Mao Zedong, with the help of millions of peasants, were able to prevail. Those who opposed China had to flee to Taiwan. So China becomes the most populated country in the world, as well as the largest communist country in the world. Mao Zedong, using Marxist ideas, implemented the Great Leap Forward, which meant to industrialize China, but in reality left millions to die from starvation. In the 1960s, Mao started the Cultural Revolution, which meant to erase all Western ideas, and once again, it failed. Freedoms sought in the 1980s by regular people, saying we want our freedom. We're tired of being a communist country. During the Tiananmen Square demonstrations, and then the communist leaders just called out the troopers and tanks, and hundreds were killed. So they seriously repressed these ideas. In the same region of the world, the Korean War, after World War II, Korea was split in between North Korea, supported by the USSR, and South Korea by the United States. So these are all kind of under the umbrella of the Cold War. North Korea decides to invade South Korea in 1950. The United Nations troops backed South Korea and fought against communist North Korea. The war ends a few years later with the splitting of the peninsula of the country at the 38th parallel. So the 38th parallel on the Korean peninsula, the northern part is North Korea, and the southern part is South Korea. Korea is still split to this day. And then one other topic that I wanted to discuss today is the Vietnam War. So similar to the Korean War, after World War II, France wanted to continue to hold Vietnam as a colony in Indochina. Vietnam fought for its independence. Vietnam split into North and South. Ho Chi Minh and the communists from the north pushed into the south, trying to unify the two regions and bringing Vietnam back together in one country. France and the United States tried to back the South Vietnamese to enable it to remain free from communist rule. First the French fought and then left, since it was their colony from the old days. The United States then took the place of the French. That would last until 1975, when the last of the United States forces would withdraw. And Vietnam was then united under communist rule. So like I said, a lot of this came under the subtitle or title of the Cold War. So remember, history's no mystery. Take good notes.